There are moments when your thinking changes direction before you realize it was going somewhere. Nothing feels interrupted. There is no sense of having avoided anything. The thought simply continues, just not where it was heading. And because the transition is clean, it passes as natural. What you don't experience is the version that didn't continue. It doesn't linger. It doesn't leave fragments behind. It disappears early enough that there is nothing to return to. So from your perspective, nothing was lost, but something was removed. And the only reason it's difficult to notice is that the part of you that would notice it is involved in the change itself. The mind doesn't only think, it also decides, with a speed that precedes awareness, what it will allow itself to approach, and this decision leaves no trace. What you're left with is not the memory of a choice, but the result of one. A slightly different direction, a new thought, a reason to look somewhere else, and no sensation that anything was interrupted. The interruption is the one event your mind will not record. Carl Jung identified something that almost nobody talks about when they reference him. Not the shadow, not archetypes, something more precise and more unsettling than either of those. He observed that a complex doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive as a foreign object your mind then decides to reject. It arrives as you. It thinks through you. What you experience as your own reasoning, your own conclusions, your own natural flow of thought. Jung argued that much of that is the complex doing the thinking, using your voice, your logic, your personality as its instrument. You believe you are the author. You are the medium. This is what makes the evasion so difficult to locate. You're not looking for a moment where something external blocked you. You're looking for a moment where you, the you that felt completely like you, steered away from something without any sensation of steering. The thought that would have arrived instead became the thought that did arrive, and it felt like yours because it was delivered by everything that feels like you. Your vocabulary, your associations, your particular way of moving through ideas. Think about the last time you were close to understanding something about yourself, something that would have required you to reorganize how you see a relationship, a pattern. There was probably a moment where the edge of it was visible, and then without resistance, without drama, your thinking went somewhere else, not because you decided to move. The thinking moved and took you with it. What Jung understood is that this isn't a failure of will or courage. It's the complex exercising a kind of gravity, bending the mind's trajectory before the mind notices it's been bent. And the deeper problem is this: the same faculty you would use to examine the evasion is the faculty the evasion operates through. Your attention, your curiosity, your capacity for reflection, these are not outside the mechanism, they are inside it. Which means you cannot think your way to the thing you are thinking around. If what was just described feels familiar, this channel is probably worth staying close to. Subscribe. Not for answers, for the kind of content that doesn't let you look away quite as easily. What you think of as your inner life is only a fraction of what's actually happening inside you. The part you can access, the thoughts you can observe, the feelings you can name, the conclusions you can trace back to something, that's the surface. Underneath it, and running constantly, is a process that doesn't report to you. It perceives, interprets, and decides. And it does all of this before you're involved. Jung spent years trying to articulate something that resisted articulation almost by nature. He wasn't interested in repression in the way it's commonly understood. The idea that a thought exists fully formed and is then pushed down. What fascinated him was the earlier moment, the moment before formation. He believed that a significant portion of psychological life never reaches the threshold of consciousness at all. The psyche resolves it first, at a level so far beneath awareness that the content doesn't get buried. It never gets born. What this produces is something specific and observable, even if its cause isn't. You've probably noticed that you sometimes arrive at a feeling without having traveled there. A low-grade unease in a conversation that seemed fine, a resistance to a decision that appears reasonable, a sense about a person that you can't trace to anything they actually did. These aren't irrational responses. They are the surface expression of a process that completed itself underground, and you received only the verdict. The deliberation happened entirely without you. The consequence of this is harder to sit with than it first appears. It means that a portion of your inner life is inaccessible to introspection. Introspection requires an object, and these processes don't produce one. You cannot reflect on what never surfaced. You cannot question a conclusion that arrived without argument. And because the verdict feels like a feeling rather than a thought, it tends to be treated as data about reality, rather than as output from a process you didn't supervise. Jung described the unconscious not as a storage room, but as an active system, one that is constantly perceiving, interpreting, and responding, entirely parallel to conscious life. The part that most people overlook is that this system has preferences. It has learned through years of accumulated experience which conclusions are bearable and which ones will cost too much. And when raw perception arrives that could lead somewhere that costs too much, the system produces a different conclusion, one that is livable, familiar, and delivered with the full emotional weight of something true. You receive it as an intuition, as a gut feeling, as simply knowing. And there is almost no way from inside the process to distinguish between a perception that arrived intact and one that was quietly rewritten before it reached you. You've probably noticed at some point that you keep arriving at the same place. Different circumstances, different people, different decisions, and yet the outcome has a familiar shape, the same kind of ending, the same moment where something collapses in the same way. And the natural response to this is to examine the circumstances, the people, the decisions, to look for the variable that keeps going wrong. But the variable that keeps going wrong is the one doing the looking. Psychological structures don't repeat by accident. They repeat because repetition is how they maintain themselves. The structure has a functional investment in its own continuity. It selects for situations that confirm what it already knows. It interprets ambiguous events in ways that reinforce its existing conclusions. It makes the familiar feel like reality, and the unfamiliar feel like risk. And it does all of this with such consistency that you experience it not as a structure operating on you, but as the world simply being what it is. The investment in continuity runs deeper than comfort. What the structure is actually preserving is coherence, a version of you that holds together, that has a continuous story, that knows what to expect from itself. And coherence, for the psyche, carries a weight that truth often doesn't. A true thing that destabilizes the coherence of who you've understood yourself to be will consistently lose to a false thing that preserves it. This isn't a malfunction, it's a priority. The psyche will protect the integrity of its own narrative with the same energy it would use to protect anything else it values. And it will do this even when the narrative is the precise thing keeping you from being able to see what's actually in front of you. What this produces over time is a life that has the texture of experience but the shape of a fixed idea. Events accumulate, relationships form and dissolve, years pass. And underneath all of it, the same interpretation runs, the same understanding of what you are, what others are, what is possible and what isn't. You've lived many years, but in some fundamental sense, you've had the same year many times. And the question that almost never gets asked is not how to change the outcomes, but what it would cost the structure to let them be different. There are moments brief, specific, easy to miss, where something almost becomes clear. Not a full realization, not an insight you could write down or explain to someone, just a sensation of proximity, the feeling that something is right there, just at the edge of what you can see, and that if you held still for another few seconds, it would resolve into something you'd have to reckon with. You felt this. Most likely you felt it more than once, and most likely, within a few seconds of feeling it, you were somewhere else entirely. What's worth examining is not what the thing was. You didn't get close enough to know. What's worth examining is the interruption itself, because it didn't feel like an interruption. It felt like a natural transition. A thought arrived. Your attention shifted, the moment passed. Ordinary, unremarkable. And yet that particular kind of moment, the one that almost becomes something, has a different texture than ordinary distraction. There's a faint quality of relief afterward. Not the relief of having resolved something, the relief of having not had to. That relief is the signal. It's subtle enough that you could spend years not noticing it, but once you've identified it, it becomes difficult to unfind. It's present in the moment after you change a subject without knowing why. It's present after you close a thought that was going somewhere uncomfortable. It's present after you decide very quickly that a particular line of self-examination isn't productive right now. The relief is small, clean, and immediate, and it marks the exact location of whatever you just moved away from. The sensation of proximity, that feeling of something almost arriving, is also more common than it might seem, precisely because it gets interrupted so reliably that it rarely accumulates into anything. You don't remember these moments as a series. You don't connect them. Each one dissolves before it can become part of a pattern you'd recognize, but they happen with a regularity that, if you could observe it from outside, would look less like coincidence and more like a schedule. The psyche returns to the edge of the same territory repeatedly, and repeatedly finds a reason to step back. What this means is that the thing you haven't seen isn't hidden in some deep, unreachable part of you. It's at the threshold. It keeps arriving there. Your own mind keeps bringing you to the edge of it, because something in you knows where it is and keeps moving in that direction, and something else in you keeps making sure you don't cross. The approach and the retreat are both yours. That's the part that's difficult to hold. You are not being kept from something by an external force. You are the approach and the retreat simultaneously, and neither one is more authentically you than the other. There is something that almost never gets said about avoidance, and it is this. The not seeing is not a failure of courage. It is an act of structural maintenance, and what it maintains is not comfort. It is something more specific and more useful than comfort. It maintains a particular relationship to your own past. This is the angle that gets missed. When people talk about why someone avoids self-knowledge, they almost always frame it as fear of the future, fear of what would have to change, fear of what would be required. But the more precise threat is retrospective. Seeing something real about yourself does not just alter what happens next. It alters what already happened. It forces a rereading of years of decisions, years of relationships, years of positions you held and defended, not as mistakes made in ignorance, but as choices made by someone who, on some level, already knew. The past becomes a different document, and most people are not afraid of who they will have to become. They are afraid of who they will realize they have already been. There is also something else that rarely gets examined, the specific utility of the blind spot for other people. Your not seeing is not a private event. The people in your life have organized themselves around it. They have learned which things you will not pursue, which observations you will deflect, which conversations will naturally terminate before they arrive somewhere you cannot manage. Some of them benefit from this, some of them need it. And seeing, fully with no evasion, would not just destabilize you, it would destabilize an entire arrangement that other people depend on. The psychological system is not located inside you alone. It is distributed across every relationship that has quietly learned to work within your limits. Seeing would be, in some cases, a breach of an unspoken contract, and part of you knows that. There is also this, and this one is uncomfortable to hold. Some of what you avoid seeing is not something that would expose you as flawed. It is something that would expose you as complicit. In the ordinary ongoing complicity of someone who has accepted a version of events that serves them, who has let a particular story stand, because the alternative story would remove a position you have quietly depended on, the position of someone who was acted upon, who did not have full information, who cannot be held to the same standard because they did not fully see. Not seeing in this specific case is not protection from shame. It is the mechanism that keeps a certain grievance intact, a certain wound functional, a certain relationship to other people as the one who did not know preserved. And seeing would not just hurt, it would cost you something you have been quietly spending for years. I have spent a long time thinking that the hard part was not having the right words for something. That if I could just find the precise way to name what I was circling, something would shift. And I kept finding better words, more accurate ones, and nothing shifted. Because the words were never the obstacle. I was. I don't say this to arrive at a lesson. I say it because I think most people who are drawn to this kind of content are not missing information. They already know more about themselves than they let themselves act on. And the distance between what they know and what they do with it is not a failure of understanding. It is a failure of willingness. And that distance is something I recognize. Not from the outside. There is no version of this that ends with something to do. No practice to adopt, no reframe to carry with you, no question to sit with before bed. That kind of ending would be a betrayal of everything this has been moving toward, because it would suggest that the problem is one of technique, that the right tool, applied with enough sincerity, would eventually get you there. And by now, you probably sense that that is not what this is. What this is a condition, not a permanent one, not an irreversible one, but a condition nonetheless. Something that operates continuously, that has been operating continuously, long before you encountered any framework for thinking about it. And conditions do not resolve because someone described them accurately. They do not lift because the person inside them finally understood the mechanism. Understanding is not the same as movement. You have always known that. You have known it in every moment you understood something clearly and then watched yourself remain exactly where you were. The question worth leaving with is not what you are avoiding. You already know approximately what that is. The question is what you have built around it. What has been constructed over years in the space that opened up precisely because you did not go there. Relationships, positions, ways of being in rooms with people, ways of understanding what you are owed and what you are not, all of it shaped in part by a space you kept empty. And the reason that question is harder than it sounds is that what was built there is not nothing. It is your life, functional, recognizable, in many ways good. And seeing it clearly as something built around an absence rather than towards something is not a comfortable thing to hold. So this does not end with a resolution, it ends where you are, which is in some sense where it began. If something in this landed, not as information but as recognition, stay close to this channel, subscribe, and thank you for staying until the end. That alone says something about you.